Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar of the virtual track of American Council's EdTech Accelerator. Today's webinar is called How to Scale an EdTech Business, Penetrate Your Existing and New Customer Segments. I suggest we use the same format as we used last time. First, we'll give our presenter an opportunity to share his presentation with us. And then if you have questions, please ask them using our chat, or you can wait till the end. We will have a Q&A session when you will have the option to unmute your microphones and ask your questions. Today with us, we have John Connell. He has more than 30 years of experience in education and education technology. He was a teacher and a school principal. He worked with local and central governments and also was an education specialist at Cisco, working with ministries of education, universities, and school districts. Currently, Mr. Connell works as a consultant and founder of I Am Learner, which is an international education and technology consultancy. A list of his recent clients includes UNESCO, European SchoolNet, and Pearson. Mr. Connell supports customers in developing strategies for incorporating technologies into the education processes from K through 12 to higher education. He's an expert on the trends in the education technology market and regularly works with international startups. So without any further ado, I would like to pass the floor to John Connell and his presentation. Please, John.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As Ivan said, my name is John Connell. Hang on. I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland, about halfway between Moscow and Washington, halfway between Russia and the USA. I'm putting some contact details up just very briefly. I will put them up again at the end of the presentation so that if anyone wants to continue the conversation beyond today, you're very welcome to get in touch with me and continue that discussion. As Ivan said, my background is in schools. I started as a teacher and as a school principal, worked in local central government. The main project I was involved in was a project called GLOW in central government, which delivered an online learning and collaborative platform to the whole of Scottish education. So every teacher, every student, every school in Scotland has access to an online platform. It's been going now for more than 10 years, still going strong, and I've come full circle in doing some work again with it, interestingly. I have blogged regularly for 10 or 12 years. As Ivan said, I worked with Cisco. I now run my own consultancy. I have a number of clients, including UNESCO. I even mentioned one or two others. I do speak regularly and run workshops regularly in various parts of the world. I've spoken at EdCrunch in Moscow. I was recently in South Africa speaking to a group of community leaders there. And as Ivan said, I have been involved with a number of EdTech startups, at least one of them with Elizabeth and Scott, who are on this call as well. And at the moment, I'm also partnering a company called Iris Connect, which is no longer a startup. It's now been going 7 or 8 years and is doing very successfully in England and Wales, but just coming into Scotland, and I'm helping them to extend out into Scotland. I want to, in a sense, reprise the role I had with Cisco. With Cisco, I worked across something like 130 countries. I visited about 45 or 50 over the 6 years or so I was with Cisco. And my role there was to help the Cisco sales teams to understand the particularities of education and how to deal with the variety of stakeholders and the variety of challenges and pain points that people in education have to deal with every day. And I hope to go through some of that today, basically. So the question is, how do you scale an EdTech startup? The answer is simple. You know your market. You speak the language of education as much as you can. You have to learn that language. You work out who you're selling to and why. These are all very basic things. You understand how to position your product. Now, that's not saying anything that anyone doesn't know, but in the particular context of education, we have to look at it in a very particular way. The one thing I will say is there really is no secret sauce to this, but what we do have are some of the best ingredients to bring together to give you an opportunity to think about how you actually approach different kinds, different varieties of education customers, depending on which part of the market, which segment of the market you're attacking. So what I want to do today is to go through how we make sense of the education market. I want to look at decoding pedagogy. I want to look very briefly at what is changing in education. Education changes very slowly, but we will look at what some of those changes are and what they're likely to be. I want to look at something particularly called networked learning, which I believe is going to be very important now already, but particularly in the future. I want to look at where is the locus of control in learning, and I'll explain what I mean by that when I come to that. We have to know the stakeholders. Too many EdTech startups fail because people don't really know the domain of education. It's not a simple domain. It's always good to be aware at least of the key or the major current research projects that are happening in education, just so that you can know some of the issues that teachers and head teachers, school principals, superintendents and so on are dealing with. I will look at one or two particular trends and issues, and then, as Ivan said, at the end we will have some discussion and some Q&A if we have time to do that. So let's talk about making sense of the education market. To do this, we have to be able to look at education. So we have to look at how we look at education and at the same time understand what you see. Education is, I would say, one of the humanities. It's not a science, it's not a craft, it's one of the humanities. And indeed, today, it's one of the digital humanities. And what I mean by that is that education is in there with things like philosophy and language and environment and sustainability and linguistics, sociology, all of those difficult to define subjects and disciplines. Education as a subject in its own right, as a humanity. Now, what that means is that just like the ancient Greek politicians, it's a place where perpetual argument, discussion, and debate goes on. There really is no easy way to say what is the right thing to do or what is the right way to do education. There's always going to be a discussion, an argument, a debate, and that's a good thing. Anyone coming into education who thinks they know all the answers to education are almost certainly wrong to begin with. So you have to be prepared to join in the conversation and join in the argument. A Scottish educator way back, he's dead a few years now, said that education is an old ramshackle windmill that goes on flapping its great arms long after the miller has left. Now, what he meant by that, this was someone who was actually speaking amicably about education, someone who sympathized with education. Education is slow moving. It does not change very easily or very quickly. A friend of mine is a guy called Ron Burnett. He's the Dean of the Emily Carr Institute of Art in Vancouver, Canada. And he has said that so much has changed in education. We are building an extraordinary infrastructure to enable us to communicate across time and space. We are more and more capable of solving problems that once seemed intractable. We are researching the very basis of life. We have gained insights into the way the brain works, and we are gaining insights into our own cultural, social, spiritual, and economic connections to the environment. And yet, so much remains the same. A core element of what education was always about has remained untouched in the midst of these upheavals. Now we can look at a particular example of what Ron Burnett means by that. This is a painting from the 14th century by a painter called Henry of Germany. And it's a scene from the University of Bologna, which is Europe's oldest university. It's a fairly standard lecture hall from the 14th century. If we bring that picture up to date and look at a lecture hall today, we can see that really, in some ways, not very much has changed. The lecture has remained much as it was or has been for many, many centuries. But having said that, though, when we look at individual countries, we can look at the USA, we can look at Russia, we can even look at Scotland. We have to know that every country and sometimes even regions within countries do education differently. What applies to Russia will not necessarily apply to the USA, and what applies to the USA will not necessarily apply to Scotland. And by the way, I don't pretend that Scotland is the same size as USA or Russia. That's Scotland compared to Florida, just to show you how small a country Scotland really is. But what we have to think about is how can we compare different education systems? What are the questions we need to ask in order to be able to come to some conclusions about the particularities of the education system we are looking at and we're trying to sell into? So what are those questions? We have to look at how schooling is structured, and this is particularly about K-12. higher education is, requires a different set of questions in a way. We have to look at what are what's the balance between public schools and private schools? What's the history of education in that country? What's the history of schooling or schools in that country? Where does power lie? Does power lie at the centre, in central government? Does it lie in municipalities, at local government? Does it sit in districts, as it does in the USA to some extent? How much power is actually devolved to school principals, for example? Where do budgets sit, and who do I have to persuade if I want to sell my product, my platform into education? And some of the answers to those will depend on what you're actually trying to sell, what your product is, what your platform is. Some more questions. What's the prevailing pedagogy? And I will come and look at what I mean by pedagogy in a moment, because it's a word that's used a lot inside education. It's not used so much outside education. But if you understand some of the questions, some of the issues, some of the arguments around pedagogy, that will start to help you think through how to segment your market for an EdTech startup. Is the curriculum textbook based, or is it more open than that? The curriculum in the USA, for instance, the school system in the USA is very much textbook based, and textbooks, in fact, in a sense, are built into the Constitution of the USA. What is the status of teachers? And if you look at the status of a teacher in the USA, in Scotland, in Russia, in Finland, in England, the status can vary quite considerably. What about the education system itself? Is it trying to develop an elite, an academic or economic elite, or is it trying to be comprehensive, trying to bring the whole of the population up and forward in terms of their education? Is education seen nationally as a public good, or is it seen mainly as a cost? And what are the pain points? What are the challenges that education is facing on a daily basis? I can look at an example. Often people will talk about the UK education system. And actually, there is no such thing. In the UK, there's actually 4 education systems. I'll look at 2 of them. There's the Scottish education system and the English education system. And if we look at the difference between those 2, actually, the differences are actually quite interesting in terms of the company I'm partnering just now, Iris Connect. They have a product which they are able to sell to individual schools in England because budgets and power are devolved in England to individual school head teachers or school principals. In Scotland, however, schools in Scotland are still run by the local authorities and by the municipalities. So our approach to selling that same product in Scotland is quite different from our partners in England. And those same kinds of questions have to be asked when you're determining where you want to take your product, where you want to take your platform. If it's the USA, if it's Russia, if it's Scotland, you have to think about different questions and work out what are the particularities of the education system you're selling into. So I mentioned pedagogy. Let's try to decode what I mean by pedagogy. If we think about the idea of learning, what does learning mean? It means about reflecting, about making sense, about building expertise, about building knowledge, of course. Now, we can look at a traditional pedagogy in which it's built around the idea of knowledge transfer, of content transfer. The curriculum's built on content, and the teacher is very much seen as the subject matter expert. Often that's a pedagogy that's used where a nation, a culture, a country wants to take a cultural heritage from the past and bring it forward to move it on into the next generation. It's often classroom based, it's hierarchical, it's based on instruction rather than necessarily than learning. However, if we look at a non-traditional pedagogy or a progressive pedagogy, you'll see quite a different language used. Words like collaboration, network learning, connections, teacher as co-learner. These tend to be used with a non-traditional pedagogy. And sometimes the language that you hear when you're speaking to people in an education system will give you a clue as to where they think they are in terms of pedagogy. So in terms of a non-traditional pedagogy, it's very much a 21st century context. Often you'll hear people talk about pervasive technology, about ubiquitous networks, about new skills, modern skills, 21st century skills. And often it quite explicitly tries to take education beyond the walls of the school. And that, of course, involves the use of technology, mostly. There's lots of talk about innovation, of collective intelligence, participation, self-learning and self-directed learning. And certainly from an EdTech perspective, a large part of what we do is about really trying to build some or all or part of the platform that enables that pedagogy to happen. Now, depending on who you're selling to, if you can position your product, your platform, to work for both of those pedagogy. Now, they're not discrete. They are both ends of a spectrum, of a continuum. And if you can position your platform, your product, to meet as many different kinds of pedagogy as people believe themselves to be taking part in, then that's obviously for the better in terms of your access to your market. If we look at traditional pedagogy, the kind of language it's used, so these are fairly traditional looking classrooms where kids are lined up in rows. And even when you put computers in front of children, in front of learners, it doesn't necessarily mean you're moving into progressive pedagogy. This is very much still, I would say, a traditional pedagogy, where each child is doing their own thing with the teacher as the instructor at the front. It's usually instructor-led. It's often textbook-based, including e-textbook these days. It's about regular testing of knowledge absorbed. It's often a centralised and managed curriculum. Now, that can either be centralised at local government level or centralised at national government level. It's aimed often, not always, but often at producing an academic or economic elite. And within traditional pedagogy, we'll often find learners being streamed and set, put in groups by their ability, and they're taught in those ability groupings. Now, if we look at some of the language around a progressive pedagogy, I won't go through all of this, but basically the language is different, the idea behind it is different, and some of the words that you can see there around things like collaboration, storytelling, reflection, interconnectedness, collective intelligence, self-organization, transparency. All of these words are the kinds of language that someone who sees themselves as working within a more non-traditional or progressive pedagogy will use as a matter of course. We can move on from that to look at what's actually changing in education. What is it that's forcing change in education? And one of the things that's definitely forcing change in education is our relationship to data, to information, and to knowledge. Now, in the past, information was scarce. Access to information was controlled. It was usually predetermined. Someone else decided what information we should see and make use of, so the choice was constricted. And the school, the idea of the school under a traditional pedagogy, it tried to spoon feed content and knowledge to us. Now, that's changing. We're now getting to a point where there's a cornucopia, a huge influx, a huge deluge of information and content. Discrimination is needed. So the relationship, for instance, between the teacher and the learner in this situation is changing. In the past, the teacher was the conduit of knowledge. He or she was the expert that brought knowledge to the learner. Nowadays, the learner can access all of that information by themselves, through the use of technology. And one of the implications of that is that the relationship between that learner and the teacher has to change. What was seen as teaching in a traditional pedagogy probably no longer works in a more progressive pedagogy. And schools are having to grapple with this right now, and teachers certainly are having to look very seriously at what they mean by teaching and how they actually practice the art of teaching. So we're moving from a position of scarcity of information to an abundance of information. And that's changing an awful lot of what is defined as some very basic and fundamental categories in education. And these are being questioned. So for instance, what is being questioned? What it means to be educated is changing. We have to think again about what it means to be educated in a world where we have access to so much knowledge that we don't depend on other people necessarily to give us access to that information. It starts to change what it means to be literate. You know, it's not enough just to be able to read or to write. There are so many other skills of communication and collaboration that are now required of learners moving from education into the world of work and through their lives. Even the very simple category of what it means to know is changing. In the past, to know something meant to have it in memory. These days, that's still important, but not so important, because if you've forgotten something, you can very easily find what it is. And again, that starts to change our relationship to information, our relationship to knowledge, and that thereby changes the core relationships within education and within the schooling system. Even questions about what is digital literacy have to be answered. And it's starting to question the importance of prescribed content within the curriculum because of that. And even the question of where does education happen? In the past, education happened in school. That may not necessarily be the case into the future, and is already not the case in many instances. One of the developments we can certainly look at is this idea of network learning. People call it sometimes network learning, or learning in the network, on the network. Today we're not just connected, we're actually interconnected. Everyone is connected to everyone else, should they choose to be. So what does it mean to learn in a network world? It changes the notion of what we mean by knowledge. Knowledge is not simply now what is absorbed and memorized. Knowledge is created, it's grown, it's personal, it's socially mediated, it's about making connections, it's about recognizing patterns, and it's about perception. Others would say that learning on the network requires particular characteristics, and it requires connectivity, of course, but also requires diversity and openness and autonomy. Now, I should make clear, I'm not saying that one kind of pedagogy, one kind of learning is any better than the other. What I'm telling you is that if you're trying to sell into the education market, no matter where you are in the world, these are the kinds of conversations, these are the kind of discussions, and this is the kind of language that is being used across and between educators. So the position of the learner is changing. The learner is no longer in that hierarchy where the teacher is at the front espousing knowledge and espousing ideas and content to the learner. Instead, the learner, in a sense, is sitting at the center of a web of connections, a very complex web of connections. And they're using that web of connections, that network, basically, to bring the information, the people, the expertise, the ideas, the resources that they want to them. The connected learner is increasingly looking at the idea of self-directed learning. We can no longer depend on the teacher telling us what to learn and how to learn. Often we have to decide for ourselves what we want to learn, what we need to learn, and how we will learn. And again, this is the kind of conversation that's going on right now in education across the globe. So the connected learner today is able still, of course, to make those direct connections, those direct physical connections with professors, teachers, with lecturers, students, visiting experts, but using the technology of search, of RSS, of video conferencing, of social networks, and so many other types of technology, we're actually starting to get access to so much more than we were able to access before. One of the questions that comes out of this is, where is the locus of control in learning? And to explain what I mean by this, if we look at this little chart, if you think about education in the past and possibly even still today, one axis is about the level of control over learning, and the other axis is the age, the maturity of the learner. So at one time, all the way through school, and even into higher education often, the teacher remained in charge. The teacher decided what was being taught, decided on the content that was expected to be learned, and the learner, although they gained a little bit more control as they grew older, never quite got past the teacher in terms of controlling their learning. So the locus of control in the past, possibly still today in many schools, most schools around the world, is still with the teacher. But I do believe that's teaching, that's changing. The teacher's role was utterly critical in that, of course. But that's changing now. If we think about how that happens now, at some point, depending on the subject, depending on the maturity of the learner, and depending on so many other factors, it crosses over. The learner is now able to take control of the learning in a way that wasn't really possible in the past. Now, where that crossover point happens is probably impossible to determine. It can depend on the subject being taught, the subject being learned. It can depend, as I say, on the maturity of the learner. But certainly the learner today should be able to, should they choose to do so, to be able to take much more control of their own learning than was possible in the past, simply because of that changing relationship between ourselves and the data, the information, the knowledge that is out there for us. But interestingly, this does not deteriorate or detract from the role of the teacher. I actually believe it makes the teacher's role even more critical, because in this new environment or this new scenario, the nature of what it means to teach is changing. So the teacher's role is becoming more complex. They have to be able to work not just in a traditional teaching sense, but also in a sense where they are facilitating and working with the learner to help them to learn. And indeed, the best teachers nowadays are saying to their students, we are all learners now, let's learn together. So they make that explicit. So the learner today, with that idea of the locus of control, is increasingly free to learn what, when, how, with whom he or she wants, and for whatever reason he or she decides. And when you're taking your particular product or your particular platform into any education market, it's important to look at to what extent or how far this kind of conversation is going on in the particular market that you're looking at. It's a different perspective in the USA from Russia, from Scotland, from Finland, from Singapore, from Canada. Each one has their own level of discourse around these questions, and it's important to try to get to some idea of where it is in the particular market you're looking at. So of course, as with any market, as with any product, with any platform, we have to know the stakeholders. Education, I think, probably shares only with healthcare the complexity of the range of stakeholders who are out there, who claim and have a rightful claim to be a stakeholder in education. So it's not just students and teachers, it's also school managers, head teachers, school principals, it's parents, it's the local community, the wider community, it's business, either local businesses or in the wider sense, business as an entity. And depending on what you're selling, depending on who is buying, then how you position your product will vary. And sometimes you have to be able to position your product, your platform, to more than one set of stakeholders. So you obviously want, if you're trying to get something to work in a school or to be bought by schools, then obviously it has to be amenable to teachers. Teachers have to see the impact it's going to have on them. It has to be a beneficial impact. At the same time, school managers, district superintendents, and so on will have to see the business case for what it is you're offering. Parents will have to know that what you're offering is something that will benefit the children, the young people in an educational sense, but that will also be safe to use and so on. So all of these questions are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself in terms of how does my product, my platform meet the needs of the variety of stakeholders that education sees. Now, of course, only one or two or three of these sets of stakeholders are the ones with their hands on budgets. And you have to be able to work, you have to be able to sell to those who have the money. But you're not just selling to those who have the money, because the people with the money will often always be often also be looking at other sets of stakeholders to say, if I buy this, will my teachers use it? If I buy this, will my students want to use it? Will they learn from it? Will they benefit from it? So you have to look at the whole phalanx of stakeholders in the same. And when you're looking at a particular market, this distribution curve is something that we always use when we're attacking a particular market. Now, whether it's a school or a district or a whole country, it doesn't really matter. There's a division between those at one end who will always resist change. So if what you're taking into the market is something innovative, something that's changing the game, then there will be people who will just simply say no and will always say no to that. At the other end of the spectrum, there are champions of change, people who like change for the sake of change, and who will jump into and take on board pretty much any innovation that comes along. It's the ones in the middle that you have to persuade, because they are your real market. So you have to find the arguments that work for those who are willing to be persuaded, but who are also willing to be skeptical and cynical. Now, the ratios between those different sections can be quite different. Often the resistors to change can be quite a large group, and the champions of change can be a very small group. But no matter what the ratio of people, of different sets to each other, it's that middle group that who are the ones you have to target and you have to get to. Every set of stakeholders has its own challenges to meet. So we have to overcome some barriers and we have to meet stakeholder challenges. I'll go very quickly through some of the kinds of challenges that education systems, schools, school districts, local authorities and so on are dealing with right now. Often we're looking at safe learning environments. We want the learning environment to be safe, especially an online environment. Education systems are trying to do more with less. They're trying to use resources effectively and creatively. Teacher effectiveness is a big subject today because the nature of the role of the teacher is changing. So we have to think about how are we empowering, or are we empowering the 21st century teacher in any real way? Learning is now not just within the walls of the classroom, it's going beyond the school. So how do we help to make the whole world a place of learning? The whole question of leadership and the definition of leadership is something that's a huge subject within educational discourse generally and globally around the world. So how do we invest in leadership? How do we help to bring vision to the process of change within education? We want to give educational access to all. We want to be fair in terms of equal opportunity for all young people. Obviously, investment in infrastructure is a core requirement for 21st century education. And lastly, anyone who can come along with innovative learning models or innovative pedagogies really has to think about it as a new teaching for a new kind of education, changing the game in education. That's what we're trying to do. It's also important when you're dealing with the education market to look at the current and key research ideas that are out there that people are talking about, that people are actually trying to put into practice. It can change almost from year to year, but there are a number of people looking at, a number of people we can look at. People like John Hattie, I'll not go into these in detail, but the URLs are there for people to follow up and look at. John Hattie he's been proposing an idea called visible learning. I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. Dylan William on formative assessment, Michael Fullan on deep learning, Guy Claxton talks about below the line learning, Carol Dweck talks about growth mindset, and there are many others. Now, these are people who pretty much any school, any education system that you walk into across the world will be looking at some of this research. And it's good if you're trying to sell into education to be able to use the language and the ideas that are coming out of that research to help you position the product that you're trying to sell. So if we look at John Hattie, just as an example, John Hattie looked at something like, to date, he's looked at something like 1,300 very large-scale meta-analyses, meta-studies into education. And those meta-studies, if taken together, involve something like 130, 140 separate research projects over the past 20, 25 years. And he's used this meta-analysis to try to work out what is the effect size of different things you can do in education that have an effect on how students achieve and how well they achieve. So if we look at this dial here, some things we do in education have a reverse effect. So if they're below zero, that low developmental effect is basically if you give someone no teaching, they will develop it to some extent anyway. The next part up to 0.4 is teacher effect. So even if you have a very poor teacher, just simply by putting a teacher in a classroom, you will have a certain amount of effect. It's only when something that you do takes the kids, the learners, over that 0.4, starts to have an effect beyond 0.4, that achievement starts to happen. Now, I'll give you some examples of this. So that 0.4 is the hinge point, as they call it. So if you look at things like ability grouping or tracking, that only has an effect size of 0.12. Retention, 0.13. Homework, one of the bête noirs of education just now, homework has no discernible effect on a child's learning year to year. The effect size is 0.29. Let's look at a few more. Small group learning, changing the size of the group, bringing it down actually starts to help. It takes it above that 0.4. This is about literacy specifically, by the way. Phonics instruction a little bit more. Study skills, teaching the children how to study, giving them the actual study skills that they can use to help themselves to study. Again, 0.59, almost 0.6. One or two more. Good student-teacher relationships can have an effect size of 0.72. Teacher clarity, the teacher working on how well they communicate, can have an effect size of 0.75. And good effective classroom discussion has an effect size of 0.82. And finally, collective teacher efficacy has an effect size of 1.57. And just to give you an example of why this is important, the company I'm working with at the moment, or partnering with at the moment, Iris Connect, they have a product which came out of educational research, and it was research specifically on the area of how do teachers work together, collectively, collaboratively, to improve their own efficacy within the classroom, helping each other, mentoring each other, coaching each other. And we use this research in particular to help sell Iris Connect into schools and into education systems here in the UK and elsewhere. So you can see the importance of research. If you can actually match what you're doing, what you're selling, the platform, the product, to some of the research outcomes that are being discussed in schools today, that can only help your case. So a few trends and issues that I want to raise. Just these are fairly random ones. We could go on about many more over time. But the kinds of issues that are being discussed across education are things like the web, of course, mobile learning, how do we change teaching? I've already mentioned bringing the learner more under control of their own learning, or giving them control of their own learning. The cloud is a huge issue just now. Social learning, bring your own device, open networks, in other words, and collaboration. These are all issues that are being discussed across education generally at the moment. But there are a few others, things like artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, big data, a culture of innovation, ideas around augmented reality and virtual reality. And I keep coming back to this, rethinking the teacher's role in the context of how the world is changing and how the world of technology is changing. If you look at one or two of these in particular, just before I do that, actually, one good source of information for anyone who's involved with an EdTech startup, every year there's a thing called the Horizon Report, which is published by the New Media Consortium, NMC. And they publish two reports annually. One is for higher education and one is for K-12. The URLs are there. The slides will be shared with everyone, so you'll be able to get hold of these URLs and look at these. If you're not aware of these reports already, you should look at them. They come out every year. And what they do, if I go to the next slide, they look at some of the issues, the challenges, the key trends that are happening in both of these domains, in higher education and in K-12. And they look at time to adoption, for instance, over 1 year, over 3 years, and over 5 years. And what they're trying to predict what will be the key technologies, the key innovations and so on that are going to be important to education over the next 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. And this can actually be a very good place to look to see how you can help to position whatever innovation it is that you're taking into schools, to position them with schools. So if we look at artificial intelligence in education, I have to say that I don't think artificial intelligence is yet being used effectively much in education, other than in those areas where artificial intelligence itself is part of what they're doing. But they are looking at things like, developing virtual mentors for every learner, looking at addressing 21st century skills, actually assisting learners with that idea of self-direction and self-assessment that I spoke about earlier on. Obviously, artificial intelligence can be used to analyze interaction data. It can bring together vast amounts of data around, and this also involves big data too, to help with individualized learning context, to develop personal interests. AI can also be used to help provide opportunities for global classrooms by increasing the connectedness or the interconnectedness and accessibility of classrooms worldwide. And this idea of lifelong and life-wide technologies is one that's being discussed in some areas, but I wouldn't overemphasize this or these ideas yet. These are early ideas. These are still at the very early discussion stage, I would say, for most people in most schools around the world. Another interesting one actually is Internet of Things. I won't get into this in great detail, but I did write a blog post a year or two ago about the Internet of Things. I think that there are lots of people with lots of ideas about how the Internet of Things can actually play a role in education. I don't think anyone, not a single one person, has yet come up with a good idea about how to use Internet of Things in education. And if you read that blog post and want to argue with me and have a debate with me, I'd be very happy to do so. But it's an interesting area, and it's one that I think will have profound implications in education. It's just that at the moment, I don't think anyone has really worked out what they can do with it. And there are many other pain points in education, and these are just a very quick and very quick list of issues that universities in particular are having to deal with right now. And this is just a very small subset of the wider range of issues and challenges and pain points that universities, higher education generally, are having to deal with right now. It's worth talking to people in higher education, different kinds of stakeholders, students, lecturers, professors, administrators, to find out what is it that is actually challenging you right now. Where are your pain points? So with all that said, to come back to how do we scale your EdTech startup, I think there's a few things we need to know. I already mentioned a few of them. You need to know the market, and to be able to know that, you need to learn the language in a sense. So all that we've looked at here over the last 45, 46 minutes is about thinking through the kinds of language, the kind of discourse, the kind of words basically that educators use on a day-to-day basis. And it's good to immerse yourself in that language and start to use it. What are the challenges in the particular segment or segments that you're attacking? Again, you have to talk to the stakeholders to find out what that are. You have to do some reading, you have to look at research and so on. Understand the changes that are happening, and also at the same time recognize education's conservatism. It's a conservative body of people and body of, change happens very slowly in education. It's like the big ocean liner. It's very hard to change direction quickly. You have to know who you're selling to and why, and can you position your product, your platform for multiple mindsets? In other words, for more than one segment of the market. And it may even be for people who have quite different ideas about what kind of pedagogy they want to pursue. Are you able to position your product for a traditional pedagogy just as much as a progressive pedagogy? Or indeed, is there an implicit pedagogy built into your product and platform, which actually limits who you're attacking, who you're trying to sell to? You have to know that before you start. You may find yourself speaking and trying to sell something that has an implicit progressive pedagogy built into it, but you're trying to sell it to someone who deploys a very traditional pedagogy, and you're probably not going to get very far in that case. And you do have to catch a flavour of what is currently hot in terms of research globally around the, in education. Just knowing some of the big research ideas and projects that are floating around at the moment can only be helpful as well. And really, education is a conversation. It's a conversation going on all the time. If you want to find a flavour of that, join Twitter if you're not already there. The educator, the teacher, the lecturer, it's probably the only group, the only professional group that actually use Twitter well. They use Twitter to share ideas, to share resources, to have collaborative Twitter chats where people can have a discourse around a particular topic, can ask questions of each other. So get onto Twitter if you're not already there and join in some of that educational conversation. It can only help what you're trying to do. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you. As I said at the beginning, I'll show you my contact details. You will be getting a copy of the slides, so please feel free if you want to continue this conversation. If there was something I said that you misunderstood or disagree with, I'm only too happy to have the conversation ongoing after today. So please feel free to use any of these contact details and get in touch in the future with me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, John, for this insightful discussion of what education is today and what it means for teachers, for learners, and for companies that are going to work with them. So now we have time for a Q&A session. Let me unmute, okay, make sure that you can unmute yourself, and yes, now you can. So you can ask your questions in the chat box, and I see we have the first question, or unmute your microphone and ask the question.
I can see the question in chat. I can answer that one first while other people are thinking about questions. Yep. Well, interestingly, the most progressive and flexible education systems probably aren't in the USA. You say except US, of course. And the US is such a big place. It's such a big education system. There are some amazing people and some amazing pockets of practice across the USA. Anything good that's happening in education globally, you can find in the USA. But the American education market is actually quite a conservative market. It's still very heavily content-based. It's still very heavily based on the notion of the textbook. It's about content transfer. And that's not a criticism. That's just a statement of the way it is in education in the USA. But so you have to think about who you're actually talking to, who you're trying to sell to, even within an entity like the USA. In terms of globally, we could look at a country like Finland. Now, Finland, for instance, is often regarded as one of the better education systems around the world. It's probably 5th or 6th always when the various measurements come out. But Finland, for instance, is trying to do something very interesting at the moment. They're actually trying to do away entirely with the idea of the subject, or the educational subject. So right from the age of 6, 7, when children come into school, through to 17, 18, when they go off to higher education, they're trying to develop a system where all learning, all teaching is done through wide-ranging projects. So children engage in projects and learn the geography, the history, the language, the science, and so on through the projects, rather than actually be taught geography, be taught history, be taught science. So there are examples of very progressive and flexible education systems around there. As I said, I will say again, you do find it in the USA, but it's not a matter of course across the USA. You find it in pockets.
All right, thank you, John. Do we have any other questions? Okay, we actually received one question via an email, and I'm going to ask it here. So, John, you mentioned, the differences between different educational systems in Russia, UK, United States. So the question is, if a startup founder is thinking about entering the UK or UK educational market or this market in Scotland, so what are the main things they need to understand about those markets? Well, let's say main 3 things.
Okay. Well, I mean, Scotland, as I said during the presentation, there are quite deep differences between even Scotland and England. So if you find yourself thinking about the UK as a market, you will have to differentiate between selling into England and selling into Scotland. England is obviously a much bigger market, and it's a much more attractive market from that sense. There's more money. It's a little bit more flexible than Scotland. So when you sell into England, you can sell very much to individual schools because head teachers, school principals actually have budget. They actually control their own budgets. They decide their own policies in terms of what they will use in terms of technology, how they will innovate, and so on. If you come to Scotland, the schools are still controlled by the municipalities, by the local authorities. Head teachers have some freedom to spend money, but nothing like in England. But also, of course, Scotland's a much, much smaller market. It's less than 10% of the size of England in terms of population, in terms of number of schools. So certainly, school by school, you will find schools in England that are like the USA, that are amazing pockets of innovation, of really interesting things happening. And if you have something that's interesting, something that can be of benefit to the learner, to the teacher, you will probably find a ready market in England. In Scotland, you have to be a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more cautious in terms of the language you use, who you approach, and how you define your stakeholders.
Thank you. All right, do you have any other questions? All right, that seems to be it. It looks like you... All right, yes, there is another one, please.
Cutting edge research. I think there's a couple of the ones that I mentioned. In fact, I can actually go back to the slide if you give me a moment. This one. This one. For me, I mean, the one that is actually being talked about most across the globe is John Hattie. John Hattie is a New Zealand academic. He's a professor of education in New Zealand. I think he's actually a professor in Melbourne, Australia right now, but he's from New Zealand. This idea of visible learning is probably the one that is being talked about most just now. So it's certainly one that you would want to look at. Schools are taking this very seriously. Now, there are some blind spots. John Hattie himself says that he has looked at this purely from the point of view of achievement, of children, learners actually achieving good grades, etc. How do you improve the grades that children are getting? He recognises that that's a limitation. It doesn't look, for instance, at at other aspects of education, at the social aspects, at the emotional aspects. None of that is taken care of. If you want to look at something that I think is genuinely cutting edge in terms of thinking about education, and the work being done by Michael Fullan around deep learning is worth taking a look at. And if anybody wants to follow this up, I'd be very happy to provide you with some links beyond the one on the screen here to help you get into deep learning. It's certainly something that I think is being taken seriously across education, across schools in the USA and Europe, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere.
All right. Yes, thank you. And one more question I see from Ksenia.
Yeah, major channels. I'll answer the last question first because it's an easier one. Social media at the moment, apart from Twitter, really doesn't play much of a role, I don't think, in education, at least in terms of someone trying to sell into education. It is used to a certain extent within education for educational purposes, but that's a different answer to the question. In terms of the major channels, the channels really have to be dependent on which market you're looking at. So if you go to the USA, the channel has to get you to the districts, because it's the districts that you sell to. You know, the federal government really don't buy very much. State government buys very little in terms of innovation. All the innovative purchases are being made at district level in the USA. In the UK, I've already mentioned that it's quite different between Scotland and England, and those differences are you know, they vary country to country, and you have to, I don't know every country in the world, you have to look at the country, you have to see how it's structured, and have to decide on that basis how you're going to channel your product, your platform to that. Big question about Chinese government. The short answer to that is yes, absolutely. Anything that's changing the economy, that's causing major changes in the global economy, and this is obviously a big opportunity for US banks to do domestic business in China. That's a big opportunity for innovative entrepreneurs to grab hold of and do something with.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? All right, then that seems to be it. In this case, let me thank you again, John, for giving us an opportunity to know your thoughts about what it means to work with education today and what it means for founders of educational companies. I also would like to thank everybody who joined us today for this second webinar. And we will see you again on December 22nd when we will have, tentatively, when we will have our third webinar. Thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you all.